My corporate partners smiled as he signed my termination letter, canceling my $8 million payout. He thought he took my life's work. What he didn't realize was that I owned the database licensing rights, and the entire system was set to self-destruct in 12 hours. The mahogany conference table at Vance Operative Logistics felt colder than usual on that Tuesday morning. Julian Thorne, the 34-year-old managing partner from Apex Capital Partners, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. Next to him, my co-founder, Howard Miller, refused to meet my eyes, staring intently at his gold wristwatch instead. Julian smiled, a thin, rehearsed expression, and told me my services were no longer required. Effective immediately, my executive position was terminated, my security clearance was revoked, and my 20% equity was declared diluted to insignificance. They were pushing me out of the company I built right before a $200 million merger with Global Freight Express. But as I calmly stood up, adjusted my dark navy jacket, and walked out without saying a word, I knew something they had completely overlooked. They thought they had acquired a fully integrated enterprise, but they had just bought a locked vault without the combination code. To understand how we arrived at this boardroom execution, you have to go back to the spring of 2018. Howard Miller and I founded Vance Operative Logistics in a cramped, windowless office near the industrial ports of Newark. Howard was the salesman, a man who could charm regional distributors into signing shipping contracts with nothing more than a firm handshake and a glossy brochure. I was the architect, a software developer with 2 decades of experience, writing algorithmic routing engines for global freight networks. I understood how trucks moved, how fuel efficiency plummeted during idle times at terminal gates, and how shipping lanes choked under seasonal demand. For the first 4 years, we were a lean, highly efficient machine. Howard brought in the regional carriers, and I built the software that kept them profitable. The heart of our business was a proprietary routing engine called Vance Route. It was not just a basic GPS mapping tool. Vance Route was a complex system that integrated real-time highway telemetry, weather patterns, port customs wait times, and driver hours of service regulations. It calculated the optimal distribution path for thousands of trucks every second. By using our system, mid-sized transport fleets reduced their operational overhead by 24% and minimized empty backhaul miles by nearly 30%. As Vance Route grew more powerful, I made a critical structural decision. I had seen too many tech founders get stripped of their intellectual property by aggressive investors. Before we wrote a single line of production code for our commercial platform, I established a separate entity called Vance IP Holdings LLC. I registered this entity in Delaware, ensuring it held the exclusive patents, source code repositories, and structural design rights for the Vance Route engine. Vance Operative Logistics did not own the software. Instead, it operated under a strict licensing agreement. Viol paid Vance IP Holdings a nominal annual fee of $120,000 for the right to integrate the routing engine into its client-facing portal. Howard did not object to this arrangement in 2018. At the time, we were struggle funding the company with our personal savings. He was focused on survival, and the legal nuances of intellectual property holding companies seemed like administrative noise to him. He signed the licensing agreement as president of Viol, while I signed as the managing director of Vance IP Holdings LLC. For years, the contract sat in a digital archive, undisturbed. By 2022, our growth curve had caught the attention of institutional investors. We were managing over $15 million in annual recurring revenue, and our client roster included some of the largest food distribution networks in the Northeast. We needed capital to scale our infrastructure and hire a larger engineering team to support the load. That was when Apex Capital Partners entered the frame, represented by Julian Thorne. Julian was a product of Ivy League ambition and private equity ruthlessness. He wore tailored suits, spoke in rapid-fire corporate buzzwords, and viewed our business purely as a spreadsheet of headcount costs and margin expansion opportunities. Apex Capital offered an injection of $10 million in exchange for a 51% controlling stake in Vance Operative Logistics. I was hesitant. I warned Howard that giving up majority control would leave us vulnerable to the whims of fund managers who cared nothing for long-term technical stability. But Howard was blinded by the valuation. The deal valued our company at $45 million. His share was suddenly worth millions on paper, and he was eager to secure his legacy. He pleaded with me, arguing that the capital infusion was the only way to prevent our competitors from overtaking us. Eventually, I agreed to the deal, but I maintained my 20% equity stake and my position as Chief Technology Officer. What Julian and his due diligence team did not realize was that their legal audit had been incredibly sloppy. They focused on VL's customer contracts, physical office leases, and employee agreements. They saw the licensing agreement with Vance IP Holdings LLC listed in the disclosures, but they dismissed it as a standard non-material related party transaction. They assumed it was a simple tax mitigation strategy and did not read the underlying covenants of the contract. For the first year after the acquisition, Julian worked to strip away what he called operational redundancies. He cut our quality assurance team, outsourced our customer support to a low-cost provider overseas, and pressured me to accelerate the release of unfinished software updates. I fought back constantly, defending the integrity of the codebase. I refused to deploy unstable builds that could cause system outages for carriers carrying perishable goods. This resistance made me Julian's primary target. He did not want an independent founder questioning his efficiency metrics. He wanted a compliant manager who would sign off on whatever slides he presented to the board. By early 2024, rumors began to circulate that Julian was negotiating a major exit. Global Freight Express, a multinational logistics conglomerate, was looking to acquire a technology-driven routing platform to modernize their domestic operations. The projected merger value was $200 million. Under the proposed terms, the transaction would close in late August, and the senior leadership of VL would receive significant stock allocations in the new, combined entity. My 20% stake was set to convert into an $8.5 million payout, contingent upon my continued employment through the closing date. It was a life-changing sum, the culmination of 6 years of sleepless nights and rigorous engineering. However, Julian had no intention of letting me collect that payout. He and Howard had already begun drafting a plan to eliminate me from the equation, believing they could run the platform without the man who built it. They did not understand that the entire architecture they were preparing to sell was anchored to a legal time bomb. The tension within the office became palpable as spring turned to summer in 2024. The offices of Vance Operative Logistics, once a collaborative space filled with whiteboard sessions and late-night pizza boxes, had transformed into a corporate battlefield. Julian Thorne spent his days in the main conference room, surrounded by a team of external consultants from a mid-tier accounting firm. They were conducting what they called an integration audit, preparing our systems and financial records for the impending merger with Global Freight Express. I was systematically excluded from these meetings. Instead of consulting me on the technical integration of Vance Route into GFE's legacy infrastructure, Julian brought in a third-party IT consulting firm, Apex Tech Systems, which was owned by one of his former business school classmates. They were paid exorbitant fees to study my codebase, trying to understand how our routing APIs map telemetry data to carrier schedules. It did not take long for me to notice the trap they were setting. One afternoon, Dennis Brooks, our principal infrastructure lead, walked into my office and closed the door behind him. Dennis was an engineer I had hired back in 2019. He was a quiet, brilliant systems administrator who managed our cloud server deployments on AWS. He sat down, looking anxious, and opened his laptop. He showed me a series of system log reports. Julian had instructed the external consultants to create a parallel repository of the Vance Route codebase and attempt to deploy it on a separate AWS staging server. They were trying to replicate the entire environment, including our proprietary database schemas and optimization models. Without my authorization, Dennis told me they had been asking him for the master database administration keys and the root access tokens for our primary API gateway. I told Dennis to refuse the request, citing our strict security protocols. Under our established compliance guidelines, external contractors were not permitted to hold root access credentials. I knew exactly what Julian was doing. He wanted to copy the entire system so that once I was terminated, they would have a running instance of the software under their direct control, bypassing any dependency on me. 2 weeks later, the corporate trap sprung its first jaw. Julian called an emergency board meeting. At the table, he presented a financial projection showing a temporary cash flow deficit, claiming that VL needed an immediate capital injection of $3 million to upgrade its server capacity ahead of the merger. As a majority owner, Apex Capital was prepared to fund their portion of the capital call. However, under the shareholder agreement, I was required to contribute my pro rata share of 20%, which amounted to $600,000 within 10 business days. If I failed to contribute, my equity would be diluted. It was a classic private equity squeeze. Julian knew that the vast majority of my net worth was tied up in the illiquid equity of VL. I did not have $600,000 in liquid cash sitting in a bank account. I protested, showing that our existing AWS infrastructure was operating at only 40% capacity and did not require any upgrades. I argued that the cash deficit was fabricated through artificial management fees charged by Apex Capital to Vol. Howard Miller sat silent throughout my presentation. When it came time to vote, he raised his hand in support of Julian's capital call. Howard had already been promised a lucrative executive vice president role in the new merged entity, along with a $3 million cash bonus upon closing. He had completely sold out. The capital call was approved. 10 days later, because I could not fund the $600,000, my equity was officially diluted from 20% down to 12.5%. My potential payout from the GFE merger shrank accordingly, but Julian still was not satisfied. He wanted me gone entirely before the transaction closed, ensuring that my remaining shares could be clawed back under a bad leaver clause in our employment contract. The pretext for my termination arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. Julian's external tech consultants had attempted to run a load testing script on our live production database, bypassing the staging environment. The script was poorly written, causing a massive PostgreSQL database locking conflict that took down our customer portal for over 4 hours. Hundreds of carriers were locked out of their routing schedules, and shipping depots across the state experienced severe delays. Julian immediately blamed me. He claimed that as Chief Technology Officer, I was responsible for the system failure and had engaged in active insubordination by refusing to hand over the master API gateway tokens to his integration team. He accused me of sabotaging the company's operations to leverage a better deal for myself ahead of the merger. On Tuesday morning, I was summoned to the main conference room. Julian sat at the head of the table, flanked by Howard and a corporate attorney from Apex Capital's legal team. The air in the room was thick with professional hostility. Julian did not offer any pleasantries. He pushed a folder containing a termination agreement and a release of claims across the desk. He told me the board had voted to terminate my employment for cause, effective immediately. The document cited my refusal to cooperate with the integration team and the system outage from the previous Friday as grounds for my dismissal. Under the bad leaver provisions of the employment contract, my termination for cause meant that my remaining 12.5% equity was subject to immediate repurchase by the company at book value, a fraction of its actual worth. Furthermore, my eligibility for the $8.5 million stock payout from the GFE merger was completely nullified. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smirk on his face. He told me I could choose to sign the agreement, accept a modest severance package of 3 months' salary, and walk away quietly, or they would file a formal lawsuit against me for damages resulting from the database outage. Howard looked down at the table, refusing to make eye contact. I looked at the documents. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or defend my technical decisions. I knew that trying to reason with Julian was a waste of breath, and Howard's silence told me everything I needed to know about his loyalty. I took my pen from my pocket, signed the acknowledgement of termination, and slid the folder back to Julian. I stood up, picked up my briefcase, and looked at Julian one last time. I told him he would find that running a complex machine requires more than just looking at a spreadsheet. He laughed, telling me they would manage just fine without my outdated systems. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the building. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing in the warm summer air. I felt no panic, no anger. I felt only a cold, calculating clarity. They believed they had won a chess game by stealing my pieces, but they had failed to realize I was the one who owned the board. I drove directly to a quiet Italian diner in downtown Newark, where my sister, Beatrice Vance, was already waiting for me. Beatrice was 45 years old and had spent the last 2 decades working as a senior corporate litigator, specializing in contract disputes and intellectual property law. If anyone understood the legal landscape of commercial software licensing, it was her. She sat at a corner booth, a thick manila folder and a yellow legal pad spread out in front of her. She looked up as I slid into the booth opposite her, her eyes searching my face. I gave her a small nod. She reached out and patted my hand, then pulled a printed document from the folder. It was the original Vance Route software licensing agreement, signed by Howard Miller and me on September 12, 2018. Beatrice tapped her pen against a highlighted section on the 3rd page. She told me she had spent the morning reviewing the contract, and Julian's legal team had made a catastrophic error. Because Apex Capital had focused their due diligence on the corporate structure of Vance Operative Logistics, they had treated the licensing agreement as a routine intra-company document. They had failed to realize that the license was not perpetual, nor was it unconditional. I leaned forward as Beatrice read the exact language of Clause 14C. The clause stated that the non-exclusive license granted to Vance Operative Logistics to use the Vance Route software was strictly contingent upon my active employment with the licensee as its chief technology officer or technical director. The clause went on to specify that in the event of my involuntary termination by the licensee, Vance IP Holdings LLC retained the absolute right to modify the terms of the agreement. Specifically, if I was terminated without cause, the annual licensing fee would automatically escalate from $120,000 to $12 million per year, payable in monthly installments of $1 million. Alternatively, Vance IP Holdings LLC could choose to terminate the license entirely upon 24 hours written notice. I pointed out to Beatrice that Julian and the board had terminated me for cause, citing the database outage and my refusal to share the security tokens. Beatrice smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made her look formidable. She explained that in commercial contract law, a company cannot simply declare cause by typing it on a piece of paper. The licensing agreement defined cause under a highly restrictive standard. It required a felony criminal conviction, active embezzlement of company funds, or gross negligence that resulted in physical injury or death. A database locking conflict caused by an unapproved load testing script run by Apex Capital's own external consultants did not meet that definition. My refusal to hand over master admin tokens to unauthorized third parties was not insubordination. It was a compliance requirement under our security policy. From a legal standpoint, my termination was demonstrably without cause. Beatrice told me that because they had fired me without meeting the contractual threshold for cause, they had triggered Clause 14C. She had already drafted the official legal notice on behalf of Vance IP Holdings LLC. The notice gave Vance Operative Logistics 2 options: pay the escalated licensing fee of $1 million for the upcoming month within 24 hours, or face immediate revocation of the Vance Route software license. While Beatrice finalized the legal filings, I needed to check on the technical side of the system. I called Dennis Brooks on a secure line. Dennis was still at the office, sitting at his desk, pretending to assist Apex's consultants with the database migration. Dennis spoke in a hushed voice, telling me that the consultants had successfully copied our customer database and our front-end web interface. They had deployed these elements onto their own AWS server instance and were congratulating themselves on a seamless transition. They believed they had bypassed me completely. I asked Dennis if they had tried to run a routing optimization schedule on their new server. Dennis chuckled softly, explaining that they had tried, but the system returned a series of critical execution errors. This was the core technical secret of Vance Route. The consultants had copied the user interface and the database schemas, but they did not have the optimization engine itself. The engine was a compiled, proprietary binary file that ran on a secure, private cloud server owned and managed exclusively by Vance IP Holdings LLC. Every time a user on the VL platform requested a route optimization, the VL server sent an API payload to our private server. Our server processed the calculation using our proprietary heuristics and sent the optimized coordinates back to VL. To maintain security, the VL application had to send a daily validation key, a cryptographically signed handshake token, to our private server. This validation key was generated by a local script on our primary database, but the database credentials required to sign the token were linked to my personal hardware security module, which was registered to Vance IP Holdings LLC. Every 24 hours, the system required my module to re-authenticate the token generation process. Dennis confirmed that the current validation key was set to expire at midnight. Once it expired, the integration server the consultants had built would no longer be able to communicate with the optimization engine. Any attempt to run a routing schedule would fail, rendering their portal useless. I told Dennis to remain quiet, do his job, and let the clock run out. We had no obligation to fix a system that had just terminated us. I hung up the phone and looked across the booth at Beatrice. She had finished signing the legal notice. She placed the document in a courier envelope, addressed to Julian Thorne and the board of directors of Vance Operative Logistics. She looked at her watch and said the courier would deliver it to their headquarters by 4 p.m. The 24-hour cure period would begin the moment the package was signed for. I leaned back in the booth, sipping my coffee. The board had spent months calculating how much money they would save by cutting me out of the $200 million merger. Within 24 hours, they were going to learn the cost of a bad contract audit. The courier package was delivered to the offices of Vance Operative Logistics at precisely 3:45 p.m. on Tuesday. Dennis Brooks texted me that Julian Thorne had received the envelope, opened it, and spent less than 5 minutes reading Beatrice's letter before tossing it into his wastebasket. According to Dennis, Julian told Howard that it was a desperate, post-termination bluff by a disgruntled ex-employee who had no legal leverage left. They went back to planning their victory party for the GFE merger closings, which was scheduled for the following week. But the laws of mathematics and software architecture do not care about private equity arrogance. At midnight, the security token on our server cluster expired. The automated cron job on VL's server attempted to request a new validation key from Vance IP Holdings LLC's authentication server. The request was routed, but because my hardware security module was offline, the authentication server returned a 401 unauthorized error code. The handshake failed. By 1 a.m. on Wednesday, the Vance Route Optimization Engine ceased processing API payloads. The regional carrier networks, which relied on our platform to build their daily shipping schedules, began to experience system timeouts. By 5 a.m., the operational collapse was complete. The regional distribution centers for 3 major grocery chains in the Northeast could not generate their delivery routing runs. Over 400 freight trucks were backed up at the Newark shipping terminal, unable to load cargo because the warehouse management system could not assign docking bay numbers or route schedules. The drivers sat in their cabs, engines idling, while terminal managers screamed into their phones. Dennis texted me updates from the office. The customer support line was overwhelmed within minutes. Over 70 carriers had called in, reporting that their driver dispatch portals were displaying blank screens. Our largest client, a national food distributor that managed 24% of the region's cold chain logistics, notified Howard's sales team that they were losing $40,000 for every hour. Their refrigerated trucks remained stationary. They threatened to invoke the service level agreement penalty clauses, which would hold VOL liable for all spoiled cargo. Julian Thorne arrived at the office at 8:10 a.m. to find his integration consultants in a state of absolute panic. They had spent the entire night trying to bypass the database errors, but they could not access the compiled binary optimization code. They had tried to write a basic heuristic patch, to route the trucks manually, but the regional network was too large. Their amateur code created route loops that sent delivery trucks in opposite directions, causing further delays. The final blow to Julian's plans fell at 10 a.m. The corporate integration team from Global Freight Express, who were monitoring the live data feed of Ease Avoal's operations as part of their pre-closing checklist, noticed the sudden drop in system activity. The real-time telemetry dashboard had gone completely dark. GFE's lead integration officer called Julian, demanding to know why the entire network was offline. When Julian tried to explain it as a minor technical glitch, GFE's legal department contacted their own auditors. They quickly uncovered the legal notice Beatrice had delivered the day before. The GFE executives were furious. The $200 million merger agreement contained a strict representation and warranty clause stating that Vol possessed clean, undisputed ownership or perpetual, non-revocable rights to all core technology. A pending intellectual property dispute and the threat of an immediate license revocation violated this clause. GFE's general counsel immediately sent a formal letter to Apex Capital, stating that the merger negotiations were suspended indefinitely until the IP dispute was resolved and the software platform was restored to full operation. If the issue was not settled by Friday, GFE would pull out of the deal entirely and sue Apex Capital for breach of contract and misrepresentation. Julian's phone went into overdrive. I sat on the porch of my house, drinking tea, watching my smartphone screen light up with missed calls. Julian called 4 times in 20 minutes. When I did not answer, he sent a series of emails. His tone had shifted from corporate arrogance to manic desperation. He offered to buy back my diluted 12.5% shares at book value, plus a $50,000 consulting fee, if I agreed to sign over the master database keys and restore the system immediately. I did not reply. By noon, Howard Miller attempted to call me. When I ignored his call, he sent a text message. He pleaded with me, reminding me of our early days in the Newark office, claiming that the merger was his only chance to retire and that I was destroying his life's work. I read the message, felt a momentary twinge of pity, and then remembered how he had raised his hand in that board meeting to dilute my equity and fire me. I deleted the text. At 2 p.m., Beatrice's office phone rang. It was Apex Capital's lead external counsel. He was no longer using threatening language. He asked Beatrice what it would take to resolve the licensing dispute and get the system back online. Beatrice told him that my terms were non-negotiable. She stated that we would not discuss any settlement terms over the phone or via email. If Julian and Howard wanted to save their merger, they would have to meet us in person at her law office at 9 a.m. the following morning. She hung up without waiting for a response. I looked at the trees in my yard, feeling a deep sense of peace. The machine I had built was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was routing the cargo, and right now, the cargo was Julian Thorne's career. The conference room at Beatrice's law office was quiet when Julian Thorne and Howard Miller arrived on Thursday morning. Julian looked exhausted, his tie slightly loosened, and his eyes bloodshot from spending the night on calls with Apex Capital's senior partners. Howard looked 10 years older, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a chair. They were accompanied by a senior partner from their external law firm, a veteran attorney named Richard Vance. No relation to us, though the irony was not lost on me. Julian did not wait to sit down before he started speaking. He accused me of bad faith and sabotage, claiming that my actions were a clear violation of my fiduciary duties to the shareholders of Vance Operative Logistics. He threatened to tie me up in litigation for the next decade, claiming that Apex Capital had deeper pockets than I did. Beatrice did not blink. She waited for Julian to finish his tirade. Then she slid a blue folder across the table to Richard. She explained that if Apex Capital wanted to enter a litigation contest, they were welcome to try. However, she pointed out that a lawsuit in the Delaware Court of Chancery would take months to resolve. During that time, the Global Freight Express merger would collapse, Vol would face dozens of breach of contract lawsuits from its clients, and Apex Capital would lose their entire $10 million investment. She then opened her own copy of the licensing agreement. She walked Richard through the definition of cause under the contract and presented the technical log reports showing that the database crash was caused by Apex Tech Systems consultants running unauthorized load tests, not by me. She also provided a signed affidavit from Dennis Brooks confirming that I had acted in accordance with the company's security policies by refusing to share master credentials. Richard Vance reviewed the documents in silence for several minutes. He then leaned over and whispered to Julian. The color drained from Julian's face as his own attorney confirmed what Beatrice had just said. The legal position of Apex Capital was indefensible, and they had no time to litigate. Julian took a deep breath, looked at me, and asked what I wanted. I took a sheet of paper from my pocket and read my terms. First, Apex Capital must repurchase my shares at their full, non-diluted value. I would not accept the diluted 12.5%. They had to pay me for my full, original 20% stake, calculated based on the $200 million merger valuation. That meant a cash payment of $9 million. Second, Vance Operative Logistics must pay Vance IP Holdings LLC a one-time settlement fee of $2 million for the unauthorized use of the Vance Route software during the post-termination period, along with a revised, perpetual licensing agreement that would pay Vance IP Holdings a royalty of 1% on all revenues generated by the routing platform under GFE's ownership. Third, Howard Miller must resign immediately as CEO, forfeiting his $3 million merger bonus, and Julian Thorne must step down from his position on the board of VL. I would not allow the people who tried to steal my work to profit from the transaction. Julian slammed his hand on the table. He said my terms were extortion. He claimed that Apex Capital would never agree to pay $9 million in cash and give up a percentage of the future revenue. I looked at my watch. I told him he had exactly 4 hours to make a decision. The GFE merger agreement had a hard deadline of Friday at 5 p.m. If the IP dispute was not resolved and the system was not online by then, GFE would walk away. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. I did not say another word. The silence in the room was deafening. For 20 minutes, Julian, Howard, and their attorney whispered in the corner of the room. Julian made 3 separate phone calls to Apex Capital's managing directors. I could hear the muffled sound of shouting from his phone. His partners were making it clear that his career depended on salvaging the merger. At 10:15 a.m., Julian walked back to the table. He looked defeated. He sat down and told Beatrice to draft the settlement agreement. The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of document preparation and wire transfers. Beatrice worked with Apex's attorneys to finalize the share purchase agreement and the revised licensing contract. I refused to enter the validation key until the funds were confirmed. At 2:30 p.m., Beatrice received a notification from our bank. The wire transfers had cleared. $9 million had been deposited into my personal account, and $2 million had been deposited into the account of Vance IP Holdings LLC. I stood up, walked over to my laptop, and plugged in my hardware security module. I authenticated the token generation script and deployed a new security key to the Vance IP Holdings authentication server. Within 90 seconds, the connection was restored. The Vance Route optimization engine began processing the backed-up API payloads. In Newark and across the Northeast, the delivery screens flickered back to life. The routing schedules compiled, and the trucks began to move. The merger between Vance Operative Logistics and Global Freight Express closed the following Monday. But Julian Thorne was not there to celebrate. He was terminated by Apex Capital's senior partners for his handling of the transaction, his reputation in the private equity sector completely ruined. Howard Miller was forced into early retirement, leaving the company with only a basic severance package and none of the bonuses he had spent months planning for. As for me, I retired at 48. I bought a quiet home on the coast of Maine, far away from corporate boardrooms and database servers. But I did not leave the software behind. Through Vance IP Holdings LLC, I still own the core engine of Vance Route. Every month, a royalty check for 1% of GFE's routing revenue arrives in my mailbox, a quiet reminder of the machine I built. They wanted to steal my portion of the company, but in the end, they paid me $9 million to keep running the system on my terms.